Hello, everybody. My name is George Hariri, and I'm going to talk to you about Introduction to Practice Acquisitions. And for those of you who do not know me, I am the co-host of the Shared Practices podcast. And you see in the upper right of your screen, that is our current logo for our podcast. A little bit about me. I'm a D4 up in Midwestern currently, Midwestern Arizona and Phoenix. And as I said, I'm the co-host of the Shared Practices podcast. And really what maybe makes me relevant to this topic is that I've looked at a ton of practice opportunities. I help people for free. I've been doing so for a few years now, helping people look at practice opportunities. And as I'm recording this, I've looked at probably around a few hundred, maybe 200 to 300 practice opportunities. I continue to get maybe around 25 a month that I look at. And I feel like this gives me a good perspective on a lot of different practice opportunities and almost having gone through the process of buying a practice many times. I also created an online course called the Ownership Accelerator, and I actually have a book, which I'll talk about at the end of the presentation. And currently, I plan on closing on a practice in Phoenix in June 30th, 2018. That'll be about 30 days after I graduate. And my mission, really why I joined Shared Practices and what we're all about, is to help younger dentists maximize their income and career satisfaction by giving them education and helping them in ways that we feel are important to their career. So a little bit of an overview of what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about practice acquisitions, and we're going to start by looking at your ideal practice. And then we're going to go into the process of assembling your team. And then we're going to talk about finding practices for sale. I like to call it deal finding. And then we're going to briefly cover valuation. And then we'll look at how you actually analyze a practice. So what kind of things you look at. And we'll be doing that through two sample practices. We'll look at sample practice number 1 and sample practice number 2. And these are two very real practices. And then we'll conclude the presentation talking about your dental market analysis, demographics, if you would. And then that'll be how we wrap things up. And then we'll go through a brief timeline of the process of buying a practice. Now, I will give you a little disclaimer here. I try my best to cover everything. And for our online course, we cover a lot of these topics. And the whole course is about 15 hours long. So I'm going to try to get everything in about an hour. And so for that reason, I have in the bottom right of your screen, you'll see season-episode. I have referenced a few episodes from our Shared Practices podcast. For more information on a specific topic, you can go visit our podcast and get more information if it's something that interests you or you feel like I didn't talk about it enough. So let's start by actually buying a practice. And so I have a couple sample practices here that I talked about before, and I'm going to read the listings, and you'll see kind of as a buyer what you're really getting at when you look at a listing. So sample practice number 1. It's a new listing priced to sell quickly. This general dental practice was established in the 1970s and collects about $1.15 million per year. It has 7 operatories with updated equipment, and your asking price for this practice is $825,000. Now, sample practice number 2. It's an excellent opportunity to own a long-standing general dental practice with revenue of about $869,000. The office has updated equipment and about 7 treatment rooms also, and the asking price is $737,000. So this is very typical for what you'll see when you're going to buy a practice. And we'll talk about these in more depth, but these are two very real opportunities, okay? And so let's see, what do we actually get from this? And, the listings are probably longer, but they say just about as much information as I have here. They're not terribly insightful. So what did we actually get from that listing, from that listing description? So we have sample practice number 1. We have its price, $825,000. Its collections, 1.156. It's 7 operatories, and they have updated equipment. Sample practice number 2, listing price, $737,000. Collections, $869,000. 7 operatories, updated equipment. So I want you guys to take a minute, and you see here I have a percentage next to each purchase price. So sample practice number 1 is listed for 71% of the 3 years average collections that I have right there. And then sample practice number 2 is listed for 85% of the average 3-year collections. So I want you guys to take a minute and think about what practice do you want? Given the information that you have and what you know about buying a practice, which one do you want? So I'll give you guys a minute. Maybe you could pause the video. Okay, so I'm going to continue on. So most of you probably said on the limited information that I have here that sample practice number 1 looks more desirable, probably because it's a larger practice, has more revenue, and it's listed for a lower percentage of the collection. So you'll be able to buy it for maybe bigger bang for your buck considering the size practice. So I want to, at this time, I'm going to go on and give you some more background information, and then we'll come back to these sample practices. but I want you to get a little backstory on how I got to know each one of these. I actually got an email on the same day from these two buyers who were looking at these practices. Sample practice number one, by the time I had gotten back to the buyer, already went under contract with another buyer. So the one who contacted me did not end up getting this practice. So by the time I had gotten back to him with my feedback, by that time, practice was gone, off the market, sold lightning speed. Sample practice number two, I get an email from the buyer, subject something along the lines of, I have this practice I'm looking at, priced at high percentage of collections. And so his biggest concern was the 85% of collections. And this practice has been on the market for months. And both practices are in relatively desirable areas. They're both metro areas, maybe top 20 population cities in the United States. They're not in the biggest markets, but there are definitely no rural practices here. They're very metro. And so both practices would be considered in desirable areas. Sample practice number one sold almost immediately, and that's probably the one that you guys selected. Sample practice number two stayed on the market for a while, and ultimately, I won't spoil the ending to this one, but we'll come back to it, okay? So just keep that in mind as we go through the presentation and come back to these sample practices. But really, when you're looking at buying a practice, I think the most important place to start is beginning with the end in mind. And what I mean by that is you really want to start your search by thinking about your ideal practice. And your ideal practice is the practice that you own as an established practice owner. So what this does for you is it allows you to look at an acquisition opportunity and compare it to your ideal practice. And so then you can think about, how do I take this practice that I'm buying and make it my ideal practice? And so that'll ensure that you're buying the right practice. And you'll know when you have found the right practice, you'll know, I think it's hard sometimes for buyers to look at a practice and think, okay, that's it. This is the one for me. I'm going to buy that practice. And so I think it's hard for buyers to do that sometimes. And having a great understanding of what your end game is will help you in the process pick the right practice. So what kind of things do you want to think about with your ideal practice? You really want to imagine yourself as an established practice owner and think about your income, maybe how many days a week you work, the hours of operation, your lifestyle, the practice culture, with the patients, maybe the type of dentistry you're doing, and that'll really have a lot of impact on the practices you're looking at. It'll make more sense as you start looking at opportunities, but you really want to have a great idea of these types of things before you can even start looking. This is probably something that all of you can do right now. And then you really want to hammer down your location as soon as possible. The reason I say that is because it's hard to prepare for practice ownership, specifically at looking for practices for sale before you know where you want to go. At the very least, have an idea of where you're willing to go and then start looking in those areas. The more flexible you are on where you're willing to go, the better opportunities you're going to eventually come up with, and the higher chance you are to find a great opportunity. So the more detailed you imagine everything, the better. So it'll allow you to better visualize the transition from the practice you're buying to the practice you want, and it'll allow you to effectively screen opportunities. So if something's clearly not a good fit, it'll allow you to figure that out quickly so you don't have to dive into the financials and maybe fall in love with how much money that opportunity makes before you actually look at it as a long-term fit to you. And so when I talk about specifying it, these are the kind of things I really want you to do. So think of 5 years from now. What does your ideal practice look like? Or 5 years from the time you purchased a practice, and relate those to an acquisition. So think about your insurance involvement. Are you a PPO practice? Are you fee for service? Do you take maybe Medicaid, HMO? I'm not going to get into the specifics on those. I think that can be a deep topic, but how big is a practice? How many operatories do you have? And I would think, for maybe a solo practitioner, maybe 4 to 6 is a good number. If you want a group practice, maybe somewhere between 6 and 10. But again, that's not for me to say. That's based on your vision and what you want your practice to be. How many operatories does that practice need? Are you planning on having associates or partners in the practice with you, or are you going to kind of run it alone? And then think about the amount of income you need and the collections and overhead that you want the practice to have. Maybe how risk averse are you? Do you want a smaller practice with less overhead, less fixed costs, less risk, maybe less income also? Or do you want to take a risk and buy a bigger practice that has more income potential? That's something I want to think about. And how much money do you need immediately upon buying a practice to sustain your lifestyle? That's very important in determining the practice size also. And then how many hours a week do you want to work, and what hours? That'll also dictate it when you look at the local competition. And then ultimately what procedure mix you want to be doing, because ultimately you'll have to go somewhere where patients need the services you want to provide. And so that's good to know up front, is what procedures you want to be offering, and find a population and a practice that does those procedures and a population that needs them. And then it's very important, in my opinion, to figure out, is this a practice that is one of one, like your only practice, or is this one of multiple? I think you look at opportunities differently if it's one of multiple. And again, I have the podcast episode referenced down here, season 2, episode 24, that'll have more information on those types of things. So before we dive into the actual process of going into the practice, I wanted to talk about the importance of practice selection. So ultimately, the idea and the whole point of having your ideal practice established is to have proper practice selection. And I think there's a ton of benefits to proper practice selection. It's the whole reason why I do what I do, speaking in the podcast and, our course is to teach you how to select a practice properly. And so ultimately, the whole point is to maximize your income as a practice owner by buying the right practice on paper, minimize your risk entering practice ownership. It'll accelerate the development between your practice you're buying and your ideal practice if you bought one that fits your vision. It'll allow you to practice the way you like, and you'll eventually enjoy practice ownership more. And I think if you ever have like the easy way and the hard way in life, I think in terms of practice ownership, the proper practice selection is the easy way of doing it, where things will just happen more naturally, easily, and you'll be successful faster, I think. The hard way would be doing the exact opposite, and that's not really something I'm going to talk about a whole lot. But that's really the goal and the purpose of thinking through every step of the process, is to have proper practice selection and an easy path into and through practice ownership. So now once you've established those things, it's really time to start your search. And that's where we have assembling your team as one of the first steps. And so this happens when you begin to actively pursue practice ownership, where you're like, okay, I'm going to be a practice owner in 6 months. That's when you're actively pursuing practice ownership, I think. At least maybe a year, but I think really 6 months, you'll really start to pursue practice ownership. And so you want to have already identified your ideal practice. You want to identify your ideal practice purchase. So like we had just talked about, the qualities that you need in a practice purchase, so you can look for those things. And then you want to know your location, your ideal practice location. You want to know your timeline, how long until you can actually become a practice owner, or how long until you want to become a practice owner. And then you want to have an ideal transition. So what does the transition look like that fits your needs? Do you want the seller to stay on? Do you want to be an associate first? Or do you want to buy the practice on Friday, seller leaves, and you start on Monday, do you never see the seller again? For each buyer, there's a new fit, and I think you need to think about what's right for you. So now you know to assemble your team. Let's go over the players in your team. So the lawyer, you'll need a lawyer to draft all the documents, the letter of intent, the purchase agreement. If there's a lease, if you're keeping the seller on, you might have an associate contract. So those are things that you're going to want your lawyer for. The broker is a huge player in any practice transition any on-market practice transition, because ultimately they're the listing agents almost. They are the ones that have these practices for sale, and you have to learn how to deal with them in a way that is to your advantage. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in the deal finding section. So then you'll need a CPA, and I'd recommend finding the accountant that you're going to use after you buy the practice. I always recommend having a dental CPA to help you in your bookkeeping and your taxes and all that stuff. So try to find that person while you're looking for a practice and have them look at the practice. They can give you advice on, maybe asset classification, or advice on, after you buy the practice, what kind of things you want to be doing as a new owner and how you want to depreciate the eventual purchase. You'll need a banker. I'm assuming you're not going to be paying cash for the practice. And so you're going to want a banker who's going to fund that transaction for you and will help you get funding for the practice purchase. And then there's a buyer advisor. I like buyer's coaches personally, because ultimately the broker is representing the seller. They are the listing agent, and they try to serve as your advisor, but at the end of the day, they're really not in your best interest. They are in the best interest of the seller. And so I'd recommend, if you want one, to get a buyer's consultant or representative to help you and your side and have your best interest as their only concern. If you want to have a consultant or a practice coach, I would try to pick them out early. That way you can start working with them as closing gets sooner, and you can maybe get some objectives heading into ownership, and you can just start off on the right foot and not have to backtrack from maybe things you've messed up. And then after you buy the practice, you're going to need somebody for insurance credentialing. And I didn't mention it before, but these start items are things that are maybe optional. They're not like necessities, versus I think the lawyer, broker, CPA, and banker are absolute necessities. These are more nice to haves. And then that's where we shared practices come in. I think we're somewhere between your friend and a buyer's advisor. We have a lot of experience looking at practices for sale and whatnot, and that's why we offer advice, and I think we could be valuable. But at the same time, we're not nobody pays us, and we're just kind of helping you out, helping you navigate the whole process. So once you have your team assembled, you really want to look at finding practices for sale. And that is where I think deal finding is extremely important. And I think if there's one thing that separates buyers that are successful to ones that are unsuccessful, I think it's your ability to find practices for sale and find good practices for sale. And ultimately, that will, I think, differentiate a successful buyer and an unsuccessful buyer. And so maybe in this presentation, I'm going to talk about it a little bit more than I may talk about other sections, just because I think it has greater importance to me at least. And so there's off-market and on-market. Off-market is when you're talking to sellers yourself who may be older, maybe looking to sell their practice, but are not officially listing their practice with any specific agency or broker. And versus on-market, you're contacting brokers and seeing what practices they have for sale that are available. My advice would be pursue both simultaneously. So talk to brokers in your area, all the brokers in your area, try to find as many practices for sale, but then also maybe try to find sellers at the same time. You really want, the whole goal when you're looking at practices for sale is to find as many as possible. It'll allow you to be selective, and it'll increase your chances of finding compatible opportunities. So the more practices you look at, the higher chance you'll have of looking at a practice and having it fit your criteria. And we have those 2 episodes down there that talk about off-market deals. So if you're interested in how to find practices off-market, I would highly recommend those 2 episodes. So when to look maybe exclusively off-market, or maybe when to go off-market if you haven't gone yet. I think if you've exhausted all your attempts with local brokers and you're not getting what you're looking for, that's an indication to me that you probably should start looking off-market. And brokers can a lot of times gatekeep. So if you think about it almost like a bouncer to a club, they only let in buyers to specific opportunities that they think are good for the seller. And ultimately, they represent the seller. So if I'm maybe a broker listing a bigger practice doing more than $1 million in collections, knowing that the purchase price is going to be somewhere close to $1 million, I'm not going to be showing that practice to a 4th-year dental student because that 4th-year dental student has no feasible way of getting financing for that practice, to the best of my knowledge. And so I'm not going to show that dental student that practice because in my mind, they're just wasting the seller's time, they're getting the seller's hopes up, and it doesn't make me look good to the seller to bring them a non-qualified buyer. So the broker's job is to meet all these buyers that contact them and find out who's the best fit for what they want. Ultimately, they're looking to sell the practice for, maybe the highest purchase price and as fast as possible. And so they're looking for those things when they're talking to buyers. And so they're almost screening buyers without buyers really knowing. And then if you're looking for maybe a unique transition, like a longer transition, maybe you associate to own, maybe you hire the seller for a couple years afterwards, those are not usually available through brokers as readily as they are off market. Because usually when a seller or a dentist, an older dentist, goes to contact a broker, say, okay, list my practice, I want to sell it. They're not thinking, I want to sell it so I can stay on for 2 years and work with the buyer. In that case, they'd probably find a younger dentist themselves and hire them and then think about selling to them. They wouldn't necessarily go with a broker. But if they're going with a broker, they're usually thinking, okay, I want to get out of this practice. I want to go retire. I'm done. And that's why they would go to a broker. So if you want a more unique transition, in my case, I'll be hiring the seller after the sale. We're not going through a broker, and that's one of the main reasons, because I think to find somebody to do a reverse associateship, it's hard to do with a broker. And so if you need any unique transition things too, like a reverse associateship, like I mentioned, or owner financing, those are indications to go off market. It'll give you a better chance to find what you're looking for. And then again, if you're motivated to get into ownership as fast as possible, then pursue both routes simultaneously, go off market and on market, and try to get your chances of finding the practice, make them as high as possible. So now here we have, I want to quickly compare and contrast on-market deals and off-market deals. And so on-market deals, let's talk about how it works a little bit. So you will talk to a broker and you'll tell them what practices you have available. You'll sign a non-disclosure agreement, and then you'll look at practices for sale. You'll go through the financials and everything, and then eventually you'll decide on a practice. You're like, okay, I want this one. It meets my needs on paper, and so I want to, maybe get to know more about it. And then at that point, you'll get to know the seller. You'll meet them, talk to them, maybe go through some charts, and then eventually you may decide on the practice, or you may decide to buy it, or you maybe change your mind. So that's kind of the workflow of an on-market deal. Again, you start with the paper. You really start by looking at the finances. Off-market, it's kind of the opposite. So you start and you get to know sellers first. So you got to get to know them. They got to like you. You got to build a relationship with them, and then you got to get to know more about their practice, and you got to look through some charts, maybe see their treatment philosophy, and you're like, okay, I like the practice. The area is nice, has a good number of operatories for me. A lot of those things on our checklist that we talked about before are not necessarily related to the numbers of the practice. So if all those things match up, they're like, okay, I'm ready to proceed, and then you look at the financials. Because a lot of times sellers are not crazy about the idea of handing over their intimate documents to somebody they just met. So you really have to fortify that relationship and build it up and maybe make sure the practice fits on all the other things so that by the time you look at the financials, pretty much if it looks good on paper, you're going to buy it. There's not really a whole lot holding you up. It'll just be more and more paperwork that'll come in the way of a deal getting done. Versus on market, you start with the paperwork and then maybe other things like the seller's personality or, maybe just other things that could come up may hold up a deal. So when looking off market, let's go through kind of the workflow of how that works. So you have two strategies. You can go and have like a small area. So if you're looking, I think let's just use 2 million people as a good baseline. So I think anything under 2 million people, I would consider that a small area. So I would think if I'm looking at an area and okay, total population of my whole area is 2 million, then I'm thinking, okay, I need a more focused approach. Maybe I don't have enough practices owned by older doctors. So usually I consider an older doctor like 55 and up. So I don't have enough practices owned by older doctors where I can just send them all mailers or contact them all in a mass. And then, there's not enough of them out there to give me enough deals to really look at. So I think what you need to do is you need to have a method that increases your response rate. So you maximize of the number of potential sellers there, you get as many of them as possible to contact you and you eventually talk to them about buying the practice. So what you need to do is you need to identify desired offices, however you plan on doing that. And then you need to call these dentists and network with them and talk to them and make them like you and make them open up about the idea of buying a practice from you. And so maybe talking to your supply reps, multiple contacts in the area, supply reps, maybe lab guys, people that know these dentists well can help you in the process, with the promise of that when you buy that practice, you'll maintain that relationship with them. And, that's their incentive to helping you out. Versus a large area, if you're looking over a number of states or a super big metro area, you don't have time or the ability to really maximize that response rate by calling dentists, talking to supply people. So what you could do is, but you have a large number of practices on your hand. So you don't necessarily need a lot of them to respond because you have a lot of practices you're contacting. So you can send a bunch of mailers or letters or whatever and some sort of mass contact, and then you'll have a lower response rate. But the rule of large numbers says that you're contacting a large number of practices, and then you will eventually get a lot of deals in return. I think a way to really emphasize and maximize this strategy is to call all those practices you sent mailers to and then tell them, I called or I sent a letter. I want to follow up with the dentist, see if they got it. Maybe you get their email and send them an email. That way you can really emphasize or increase your response rate. And then you kind of have the best of both strategies. You have a high volume of practices with a higher response rate. And then some cool things that I think would be nice touches, maybe having a personal website. Because when somebody gets a mailer, I think there's a high barrier to call you and talk to you. Maybe they want to look into you a little bit more. And so maybe you have a personal website set up with some maybe attractive things about you as a buyer that they can go visit that website and then think about calling you later. And then having maybe a custom number or voicemail so you know when these calls from sellers are coming in. I think that's a nice idea. I've seen a few people do it. It's been successful. Now, when you actually meet a seller, it's very important to know how to talk to them and know how to interact with them properly so that you can get a deal done. And so I'm going to run through kind of the process of an off-market deal. So typically there's some initial phone call. So you'll talk to them on the phone, you'll get to know them, you'll hear a little about their practice. Really what you want to focus on here is just getting to know them, asking them questions about themselves, and just maybe seem very interested in them, be very interested in them, and find out as much about them as possible to assess the fit of the personality. And then you'll have some sort of first in-person meeting, and then you can maybe start to probe a little bit on the numbers of the practice and, very general stuff to see if it's a good fit, how many operatories you have, kind of stuff like that to kind of go through your list of things you're looking for. And then eventually there'll be some sort of office tour. You look at the office, and at this point you should really hammer out all of the other things that maybe are in the way of you wanting the deal that are not on paper. So maybe anything else you want to look at, the facility, the area, the curb appeal, the visibility, anything else that you may consider as a factor in your decision, you really want to get all that stuff done before the office tour is done. So talk to them about their treatment philosophy, talk to them about their CE, talk to them about their staff, what's the situation there, does their wife work at the practice, and then ultimately you kind of make some preliminary decision. You're either like, okay, this isn't a good fit for me, I'm moving on. I appreciate your time, but I just don't think it fits my long-term goals. Or you say, okay, well, I really like this practice and I want to learn more about it. I feel like at this point, I'm really dedicated and I think your opportunity is fantastic and I think we could work together or it could be a smooth transition, whatever. And you say, but at this point, I really need some more information. And so I'm going to need some financial information to make a decision or give you a formal offer. And so is that something you're comfortable with? And if you are, then I need so-and-so documents. And then typically at the very minimum, you're going to want a profit and loss statement, tax return. Tax return you might not necessarily need right up front. I personally didn't get it, but I had a lot of confidence in my opportunity. Maybe some production reports to see what's going on in the practice, and then maybe a payroll information on what the staff is making so you can make a decision on that. Because as you'll see later, I put a lot of weight into this team's expenses. And then at that point, you're probably going to make an offer. And then during the due diligence, you can go in and get all the rest of your paperwork after you make an offer and offer is accepted. Then you'll go through the very long process of buying the practice, and then you'll be able to get all the other information that you may be needing. So at this point in our process of buying a practice, we've talked about how to assemble your team, how to find practices, and now we're going to talk about how to screen opportunities. And I have this maybe abstract chart. I love this chart. People who've taken my course maybe don't necessarily fall in love with it as much as I do, but I think it shows a lot of great points. So I'm going to talk about it for a little bit. So I have here, this is an abstract diagram, but really I'm trying to make a point here. I'm trying to make a point that your ideal practice is in one place, and every other practice you look at is in a completely different place. And it's usually some seller's ideal practice. Most of them are very happy with the practice they have. And so, especially if you're buying a higher producing practice, the seller has a lot of pride in that practice. And so this is somebody's ideal practice. And so you really want to think about, okay, so I'm buying somebody else's ideal practice. I'm buying practice A or practice B. And I need to think about, how do I make that practice my ideal practice? And you want to think about that path. And is that a straight path, or is that maybe more difficult? And so I think as you're looking at opportunities, some of them will be further or maybe closer to your ideal practice. And you want to think about that when you're looking at and analyzing these opportunities. What things have to happen to this opportunity to make it my ideal practice? And some things are hard to change, like the number of operatories it has or where it's located. Some things are easier to change, like the procedure mix that's being offered. You can come in and offer a new procedure relatively easily. So as you're screening opportunity, think about what has to happen to make this my ideal practice, and is that a difficult change or not? And that's really what I want to get across in this opportunities in this image, because all the practices you're looking at are vastly different, and they all have their own pros and cons. And you need to know, when you're looking at a practice for sale, is this one that fits my ideal practice, and will it be easy for me to make this practice my ideal practice? So now, before you actually get into the numbers and everything, you want to do some sort of initial screening. And so you want to ensure that it meets all of your non-negotiables, all the things you have to have, like where you're located, what hours of operation you want to have, anything that for you is like, it's a deal breaker. You want to make sure you get that stuff out of the way and figured out before you actually dive into the financials and spend a good amount of time, a few hours, going through all the paperwork. Maybe look at your negotiables too, but I really want to focus on the non-negotiables. And then if the opportunity passes the test, the initial screening, then you actually calculate a valuation. And you want to see, is the purchase price falling within that valuation range? And valuation can be calculated in a couple of ways, and I'll talk about it on the next slide. You can do it by EBITDA, and I'll talk about what that means, or you can do it by like your net income, the amount of income that seller makes. So like I said, it can be calculated as a multiple of net income, or it can be calculated as a multiple of EBITDA. And EBITDA we'll talk about in a minute, but just to give you some baselines, so EBITDA is, if I had to give it in layman's terms, it's really the amount of money that Heartland Dental makes from owning a dental practice. I'll put Heartland Dental as an example. So somebody that buys a practice, has a dentist in there doing the dentistry, that is how much money the practice makes. So versus a net income, which is an on-site owner. So the seller who selling you the practice, how much money are they making? When you buy the practice, before you pay your debt and taxes, how much money are you making? And that's what net income is. So those are different multiples, but usually I have this baseline here of multiple of the profit from the business, like Heartland would get profit, is 2.5 to 5 times that number, I think would be a proper value for a practice. And not just me thinking, that's kind of people who value practices this way, which I think is a much better way. And net income is 1.3 to 2.5 times. And your local market will dictate where in that range your practice falls. The more desirable your local market is, the higher those multiples will be. But ultimately, I believe firmly in staying kind of within these limits. And I think a percentage of collections, valuing that is a flawed measure of practice value. So in the beginning of the presentation, I had you guess what a practice is, what practice is more desirable, and I baited you into using the percentage of collections as a way of doing that. And the reason I did that is because a lot of brokers, a lot of buyers, pretty much everybody else who does this in the process bases everything on the percentage of collections. And I think it's incredibly flawed, and I think these two sample practices that we're going to go over in a little bit will show my point exactly. So which valuation multiple is more important to you? I think if you're going to maybe own multiple practices, or you're going to be an absentee owner, EBITDA is very important to you because you're paying an associate to do the dentistry and then you're taking what's left. And that's exactly what EBITDA is. So that stands for earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. But really in English, it's the amount of money the business is producing for an investor. Versus an on-site owner, you're looking at your net income. So if you're going to buy this practice, it's going to be your only one. You're going to go in there, you're going to do the dentistry for 30 years, and you're going to retire. Then really what you want to do is you want to look at your net income. And that is the amount of money that you're making from, working at your own practice. It's almost like a job. And so I still think it's important to know your EBITDA because you need to know in a second, and I'll talk about it in a bit, why if you're buying a job or a business. So, but to sum this slide up, you're really talking about the salary as a clinical owner before your taxes and debt service. So how much money are you making being the dentist at this practice and running the practice at the same time? So now let's talk about some main analysis factors. So again, you want to start by looking at, am I buying a job or am I buying a business? After you've calculated the valuation, you should know. A job is if you have like low profit from actually running the practice, but you have sufficient income. So the majority of your income is coming from your work as an associate in your own practice, if that makes sense. Paying yourself to do the dentistry is the majority of your income, and you're getting maybe less income on the business, running the business of the practice. Versus if you buy a business, even if you're an on-site owner, maybe a majority of your income is coming from hygiene or maybe another associate you might have, or for whatever reason, your own production is less of a proportion of your income than if you're buying a job. So ultimately, the whole definition to me of buying a business is you're essentially buying the ability to make money using other people's time. So if you're buying a job, you're making money mainly from your own time and efforts. If you're buying a business, you're making money partly because of your time and efforts, but mainly from other people's time and efforts. And I think that, for me, that's where I want to be. I think every practice evaluation I'm looking at is a job or a business. Then you want to look at the reproducibility of the production. So the seller, are they doing things that I can do? Maybe are they doing things that maybe I can add things that they're not doing? Or maybe they're doing things that I cannot do. You want to know how reproducible is what they're doing. Because ultimately, if you're buying the practice, you or somebody else will have to reproduce that production. Then you want to look at the doctor to hygiene ratio. And I think this is important for a lot of reasons. I think one, it'll maybe if there's more hygiene, you're more buying a business than you are buying a job. But another one is the ability to reproduce production, I think, is a lot easier if there's more hygiene in the practice. One, because you're responsible for less of the production. But two, I think hygiene is my way of looking at active patients. I don't necessarily love the active patients number that everyone always talks about. I look at hygiene percentage. So I look at the number of people coming through the practice on any given basis is hygiene. And I feel like that's fuel. That's the number of exams, that's the number of patients you're seeing. So I use hygiene as a method of calculating your patient flow and the amount of patients you're seeing. And I think that can show you how much opportunity on a surface level. It can quickly show you if there's a lot of opportunity in the practice, or maybe it's going to be difficult to reproduce that production. I'll talk about that on the next slide. And then you want to look at the existing expenses. So you want to look at, okay, I think the two biggest ones are your facility and your staff, because those are your fixed expenses. I think those are the two hardest line items to change. It's very hard to change people's salaries or fire them and have the practice function the same way. And it's even harder to move your location or decrease your rent or change your facility expenses. So you really want to start by looking at your fixed expenses as a practice owner. And I think that's the first thing I look at when I'm looking at profit and loss statement are those two numbers. And then you kind of look at everything else, knowing that it's maybe more changeable. So then you want to look at the growth potential. I mean, depending on how big you want your ideal practice to be, you might need more or less growth. And you want to see, if I need a lot of growth, where's that growth going to come from? You can look at internal growth, which would be adding new procedures, maybe doing things a little bit better, keeping the same number of patients the same, but maybe producing or collecting more from those patients. Versus external growth is bringing new patients into the practice. That would be more dependent on your local market and their market analysis and demographics and all that. And we'll talk about that at the end of the presentation. So now we're going to talk about your hygiene percentage. I promised I would. And I really recommend buying a practice with a minimum of 25% of the total collections coming from the hygiene department. And that means procedures the hygienist is doing themselves. So that's taking x-rays, taking bite wings, and actually the process of doing the prophies and perio maintenance and all that stuff. I would want that revenue to be between 25 and 30% at the minimum. And I think that's kind of average. I think anything below that is either difficult to reproduce and you're almost buying a job because you don't have the hygiene department helping you collect the number that they're collecting. And I think below 20, there's maybe a red flag there. Maybe there's procedures that you can't do. Maybe the seller's being a little aggressive in their treatment recommendations. I don't want to judge people's diagnostic tendencies, but typically when you see a practice below 20% hygiene, that's what I'm thinking. Anything above 30%, I'm thinking there's some growth opportunity there. Maybe some procedures are being referred out, like endo or something that can be brought back in and cause a little bump, and that's why the hygiene is a larger percentage. So the doctor is not producing a lot off the same number of patients is kind of the way I like to think about hygiene. And then maybe more than 35% I think is like above the average for what is like a healthy hygiene or healthy growth opportunity. And they're out there. I would just confirm that that is actually the case and you're not maybe mistaken, or there's not a whole lot of maybe upsells in the hygiene department. Something, you just want to confirm it. Anything above 35%, I'd want to look twice at it before I believe it. So talking about internal growth, that is all the things in the practice that lead to increasing the revenue per patient. So if you buy the practice and you want to change the way it works to maybe make more money or collect more off the same number of patients, you're going to want to look at adding procedures like placing implants, endo, especially molar endo. A lot of times sellers refer that out because they're older and they don't necessarily feel like they need to do it anymore. Maybe some surgical extractions that the seller doesn't do that you may be able to do. And then ultimately you want to look at the hygiene department too. Are they doing a lot of perio services or are they mainly doing prophies? You want to see, are they diagnosing, based on a large number of practices, are they diagnosing within the norms of everybody else? And again, I'm trying not to be controversial in these statements. I'm just talking about trends. And if they're not diagnosing a lot of perio, chances are you come in, you might diagnose more perio than the seller. I'm not saying the seller is underdiagnosing or you're overdiagnosing. I'm just saying that's diagnostic tendencies. And so are they doing a lot of fluoride or sealants? Are there opportunities in the hygiene department to grow the practice? And then ultimately, I think the two biggest forms or sources of internal growth are the hardest to estimate, I think, is increasing case acceptance. So if you can go in and maybe talk to patients and help them see value in treatment that maybe the seller wasn't as good at, or maybe I think you actually at a disadvantage initially because the seller has a relationship with these patients and they trust him. And so you're going to have to build that trust. But then if you can eventually increase case acceptance through a lot of various methods talked about, I think that'll be probably your biggest source of growth. And then ultimately, if the seller's diagnostic tendencies are different than yours and you come in and you may be diagnosing things that the seller wasn't, I think that's another form of growth. And I think those two are probably the biggest opportunities, but ultimately that is very, controversial and provider specific. So now this time we've talked about everything inside the practice. The only thing I'm going to talk about after this is the process of looking at the actual opportunities around in the market and, your demographics and all that. So I really think at this point, I think we're ready to go back into the sample practices we were looking at. And so just a little review. Sample practice number 1, highly desirable practice, $1.15 million in collections, selling for $825,000, 71% of collections. Sample practice number 2, selling for 85% of collections, $869,000 in collections, priced at $737,000. So I got these two practices on the same day. And like I mentioned before, sample practice number 1 was gone before I could even get back to the buyer. Actually, this one took me a couple weeks, but it was gone in a couple weeks. Sample practice number 2 on the market for months. The buyer emailed me telling me this is priced for a high percentage of collections, no rush on the eval because it's probably still going to be in the market. So they were this was very stale in the market, sample practice number 2. So of course, I got the financials back and I'll run through them on what happened with these two practices. So sample practice number 1, like I said, the collections, 1.5 million. The normalized overhead was about, and the 1.15K, it's actually supposed to be an M, so 1.15 million. The normalized overhead was about $909,000. So that's 80% overhead. So the owner was taking home 20% of the collections as their income. So fixed expenses, that's the thing I said. First thing I look at is fixed expenses. So you have 54% fixed expenses. I said on the previous slide, 38% or less. So the staff is 37%. Right there, it's almost the whole thing. Facility expense, 17%. So those are both extremely high. I would like to see each of those about maybe 10% lower. So we're way overdue on our fixed expenses are way too high. Net income is $227,000. So the seller is making $227,000. Now hygiene percent, 32%. That's fine. Some mild opportunities for growth maybe. Now the associates pay. So if I was Heartland and I owned this practice, I would have to pay an associate $241,000. But the net income for the whole practice is $227,000. So if I'm Heartland, I'm losing $14,000 a year owning this dental practice before I've even paid for the debt or even paid for my debt service or anything. But your debt service on that purchase price, given average loan terms and whatnot, is $127,000 a year. So if you're Heartland, you're losing like $141,000 a year. you're losing if you're Heartland on this practice after you pay your note and pay your associate. So not a great opportunity for Heartland. But as a buyer owning the practice, you can make a whopping $99,000 a year after you make the money the seller was making and then you pay your debt. So if I'm an associate looking at this practice, I'm thinking I'm probably making more than $99,000 a year right now, and I don't want to take on, $127,000 a year of debt service to give me the opportunity of making $99,000 a year. I'm not terribly excited about this. And I'm also responsible for 1.51 million of production, right? So I'm thinking this is a terrible opportunity, not going to make any money. Sample practice number 2, it's $869,000 in collections. Your overhead is $472,000, so 54%. And the fixed expenses is about 1% too high, and the facility expense is the main source of that. And so I went back and I contacted this buyer. It turns out the seller owns the real estate and is upcharging the rent for tax write-off. So in that case, it's not really applicable. The fixed expenses are a little inflated on this. But again, it's important that that's what came out to my end. That's what I want you to see. The seller who owns this practice is making about $400,000 a year. They're 30% hygiene. And if Heartland owned this practice and was paying an associate, they'd pay them $188,000 a year. So Heartland would be making $208,000 on this practice. Their debt service on this would be $102,000. So as a buyer, the buyer who actually bought this practice is the one who contacted me. He has an expected first-year income of $295,000 after he pays his debt service. So that's 3 times more than the practice that everyone thought was more desirable. And it wasn't just you guys who thought that. It was the buyers out there who bought that practice in like a week. It's just... So here I have them side by side. And so you can really see that point more and more. Let's go here to the total take home at the bottom line. So we have our net income multiple. We talked about that. So we have 3.63 on sample practice number 1. That's above the 2.5 that I talked about. The net income multiple here is 1.85. And so that's between the 1.3 and the 2.5 that I talked about before. The EBITDA multiple, negative 56. So that's just like, negative EBITDA messes with the whole thing. It's just extremely high multiple. Very, very poor opportunity for somebody like Heartland. Versus the sample practice number 2, it's 3.53. And this, the range I had talked about before was between 2.5 and 5. So on the lower end in both of these categories. Your hygiene percentages are kind of about the same. I think they're mainly irrelevant. Fixed expenses, I think, is the biggest make or break in both these opportunities. Much higher in sample practice number 1. And that leads to a lower total take home after your debt service of $99,000 for the buyer. And then for the buyer of sample practice number 2, it's $295,000. And so ultimately, again, sample practice number 2 produces or collects less, it's priced less, and it makes 3 times more. So why are we even looking at the percentage of collections? And that's why I think it's a little bit of a moot point that one practice is priced at a higher percentage of collections and appears like a worse deal and it's been on the market for months, when in fact it's a fantastic opportunity to make somebody $300,000 a year to go in and not even have to do $1 million of production. I think that's great. And so ultimately what ended up happening is sample practice number 1, the buyer who contacted me dodged a bullet. Some other buyer bought it in like a week, and I don't know what's happening there. I don't know that buyer. Sample practice number 2, the buyer ended up buying it. Actually, I think they closed on it as I'm recording this, maybe about a month or 2 ago. They closed on the practice, and I haven't followed up with them since, but I know they closed on the opportunity, and so they are the owner of sample practice number 2. When they initially contacted me, they were like, oh, this is going for a high percentage of collections. I want to offer a low ball offer, and I told them, no, pay full price for it. It's well worth it. And that's what they ended up doing. Now let's talk about external market, your growth opportunities and your demographics. And so how I look at this is when I look at a sample practice, so I looked at those numbers right there, right? I looked at the numbers. I'm like, well, how much growth does this buyer need? And where is it going to come from? So we talked about internal growth, but now external growth I think is more abstract. And I think if you need growth beyond 30%, then that's when you would look at external growth. And that's when you look at, simply adding procedures won't be enough. Maximizing the internal workings of the practice I don't think it's going to be enough to get you where you want to go. So really, the more growth you need, especially above 30%, the more you're going to rely on your local market. And I don't have time to talk about it as much. I have a podcast episode right there referenced, but I'm going to kind of introduce you to this concept that I think is important that not a lot of people know about. So I have 2 images, and if I'm a dentist looking to start a practice, where am I going to put it? And I think let's answer that question for a second. So here on the left, I have commercial real estate listings for the northwest side of Tucson. I'm from Tucson. I moved up here from the northwest side. And so I know this area very well. And I actually went through on the right and I plotted all the dentists. But if you see here, there are a lot of commercial real estate listings in some specific areas. We have this road down here, kind of going north and south, and that's called Oracle Road. And they have a road going east and west called Ina Road. And there's a lot of commercial real estate listings on both of those streets. And on the flip side, you have a lot of dentists on those streets. And people are more diffuse. I think they kind of go everywhere. And so if you had to guess, I would say that, and I know that because I've looked at this, that dentists are not as prevalent in the more diffuse parts of the where there are not as much commercial real estate. And so what this does is allows you to find out maybe areas where there are less dentists and there's more opportunity, and you can almost have the advantages that everyone talks about being rural, like a lot of patients, very little competition. You can have that in the metro area. I feel like people say like Tucson is saturated, Tucson's unsaturated, Phoenix is saturated, but really we're looking at a part of Tucson. We're looking at the northwest side of Tucson. And you can see here from the image, there is a lot of opportunity here for something like Practice B. I see the yellow one on the image. They're pretty much by themselves. They may as well be rural in the middle of nowhere, even though they're in the northwest side of Tucson. So I don't think you can really say for demographics, you can't really generalize like everybody likes to. I think you really need to look at the specific opportunity. And that's what brings me to a single site study. So you look at your practice and you look at how much growth is needed. And that'll give you the importance of the demographics and the opportunity and the market analysis and your competition and all that. And so if it's necessary and you need more than 30% growth, I would order a demographics report. I like a company called Dentagraphics, but there's plenty out there. And use your understanding of external growth opportunities to aid your decision about making your decision making about a specific practice. So you want to use your understandings of where it's at, maybe do a single site study. You can see the competition around that actual practice, and then maybe you can look at the competitors and what they're doing. And then that will allow you to decide, is the growth that I need to achieve externally feasible or is it difficult? And ultimately, that's what you want to determine. Is this easy for me to find or is this not going to be easy? And that'll allow you to know if your opportunity is a good one for you or not. And I would throw in visibility here. I don't have it on the slide, but I think your visibility is incredibly important, especially if you want some external growth. I think that's a big, big factor. So ultimately, at the end, you're going to want to make a decision. And I think you need to evaluate all the information you've gathered, your initial screening, your need for growth, where that growth is going to come from, if this practice has sufficient income for you, if it's within the purchase prices and within the valuation range, and look at the fixed costs. If all those boxes are checked, I would send it over to a CPA or a professional to take another look, but I would probably submit an offer and hopefully get that practice, because I think it's hard to find a practice that checks all those boxes, but that's ultimately what you should be looking for and what you should settle. You should not settle for anything less, I don't think. And I think that's where, again, where deal finding comes in. Being able to generate and find a lot of practices for sale will really help you out here. So then let's kind of run through the timeline. So now we have submitted an offer and now we have an accepted offer. So now you set a closing date. So typically that is 3 to 5 months after the offer is accepted. And then for about a month or two, you do some due diligence and you'll look through all the intimacies of the seller's paperwork to make sure there's nothing that you missed before. And you'll negotiate the purchase agreement and all the little things like the non-compete and, the classification, the tax ramifications of the sale and everything like that. And then you'll start transferring all the utilities and all the little stuff that needs to be done. And then you can, at that time, maybe hire a coach, prepare for ownership. And then the final month prior to closing, you really want to make sure that you've covered everything on your checklist. If you should have a checklist on things to go through and make sure you're getting everything done. And then on closing day, you're now a new practice owner. And I have successfully walked you through the whole process of buying a dental practice. And I think that's in and of itself a long process. And so I have some episodes here to help you with the timeline and the transitioning ownership stuff. But ultimately, that really concludes the presentation today. I appreciate your time. And for more information, I actually wrote an ebook about my experience with buyers. And so for more information, you could read my book, The Keys to Buying the Right Dental Practice. It's explained using real stories from real buyers. So like I talked about in the beginning, I've looked at a lot of practices, like Sample Practice 1 and Sample Practice 2 are actually chapters 6 and 7 of the book. But ultimately, you can get that book at book.sharedpractices.com. You can also get this presentation on the resources page of our website. And for any questions remaining, feel free to email me. I can't stress enough how much I encourage you to contact me if you have any questions or concerns. I'm fairly quick responding, but very thorough in responding. I usually get you what you're looking for, and a lot of the experiences I've had and have been fortunate to have are due to the fact that people have contacted me and I'm gladly answering any questions that any of you guys have. So please feel free to email me anytime, and I'll be more than happy to help you out with anything that I could do for you. Thank you very much for your time, and I appreciate it. I hope you learned a lot from this presentation. I really enjoyed giving it to you, so thank you guys very much.